On September 30th, 1980, a cruise ship named MS Prinsendam slipped away from her berth in Vancouver, Canada, carrying 320 passengers, many of them retirees who had saved for years for this trip, and 205 crew, mostly Dutch officers and Indonesian staff. It was the start of a month-long Holland-America Line voyage toward the Far East. Within 4 days, that voyage would turn into something none of them could have imagined. Not a luxury cruise, but a fight against fire, freezing seas, and one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in maritime history. This is not a dramatized retelling. It is one of the most thoroughly documented sea rescues of the 20th century, reconstructed from U.S. Coast Guard records, survivor accounts, and official investigation reports. And it remains, to this day, studied as a textbook example of what happens when disaster at sea collides head-on with worsening weather hundreds of miles from the nearest port. Prinsendam was a relatively small, elegant ship for her era, 427 feet long, built in the Netherlands in 1973, purpose-built for comfortable, unhurried cruising rather than speed or scale. Her route was the classic Alaskan run in reverse, north along the inside passage of British Columbia, a call at Ketchikan on October 2nd, a visit to the glittering ice walls of Glacier Bay on October 3rd, and then, that evening, a turn away from the sheltered coastal waters and out into the open, notoriously rough Gulf of Alaska, bound for Japan on the long transit toward Asia. By midnight, the ship was more than 100 miles from land, in seas that were already building. Few passengers were still awake. Most had gone to bed after the first night's entertainment, unaware that far below their staterooms, something had already gone wrong. At around 12:40 a.m. on October 4th, an assistant engineer performing a routine filter change in the engine room touched off a leak in the ship's low-pressure fuel system. Within minutes, flames were spreading through the machinery spaces. The crew sealed the compartment and flooded it with carbon dioxide in a bid to smother the blaze, standard procedure and one that should have worked. It didn't. The fire kept burning, feeding on fuel and structure alike, and by roughly 1:40 a.m., the captain, Cornelius Dirk Wabeka, declared it out of control. What followed was a moment of genuine tension between protocol and survival. Wabeka, worried that a formal SOS would legally open his ship to salvage claims by any vessel that responded, initially held back from sending the full distress signal, sending only an urgent advisory instead. His chief radio officer, Jack Vanderzee, disagreed and sent the SOS anyway, reportedly telling colleagues afterward that he would rather lose his license than lose the ship. That decision likely saved lives. Coast Guard communications station Kodiak picked up the signal, and the alarm began radiating outward across Alaska's search and rescue network. Passengers were roused from their cabins around 1 a.m. and directed to the promenade deck, many still in nightclothes, some barefoot, a few still dressed from the previous evening's dinner. They were told, gently, that there was a small fire in the engine room. By 3:30 a.m., the fire had climbed several decks, reaching the dining room and cabins above the engine spaces, and the truth of the situation was impossible to disguise any longer. Prinsendam was roughly 120 nautical miles south of Yakutat, Alaska, far outside the normal range of Coast Guard helicopters, and hours from the nearest port by any vessel. What made the rescue possible was a remarkable, improvised coordination between agencies that had never trained together for exactly this scenario. The Exxon tanker Williamsburg, only about 90 miles away and loaded with 1.5 million barrels of crude oil bound for Texas, picked up the distress call and turned back immediately. Her master, Arthur Fertig, offering his enormous, mostly empty deck space as a place to bring survivors. The Coast Guard cutter Boutwell got underway from Juneau. Cutters Woodrush and Mellon converged from Sitka and further south. Long-range helicopters were scrambled from Coast Guard Air Station Sitka and Air Station Kodiak, the latter more than 400 nautical miles away, alongside U.S. Air Force rescue helicopters from Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage, and, remarkably, Canadian Armed Forces helicopters flying in from across the border, since they alone had the range to reach the stricken ship and return. At around 5 a.m., with flames now visible on deck, Captain Wabeke gave the order to abandon ship. Passengers were lowered into lifeboats, in darkness, in rolling seas, just as the first rescue aircraft began arriving overhead. If the fire alone was not danger enough, the weather had a cruel timing of its own. The remnants of a Pacific typhoon were pushing into the Gulf of Alaska, even as the rescue unfolded, and conditions deteriorated hour by hour. What began as manageable swells built through the operation to seas estimated at 25 to 35 feet, whipped by winds that climbed from around 25 to 30 knots to gusts near 45 to 50 knots by the time the last survivors were being lifted clear. Weather nudging toward full storm force, adding brutal difficulty to an already extraordinary task. Transferring hundreds of frightened, seasick, and in some cases elderly and unwell survivors from pitching lifeboats onto a moving tanker deck, or hoisting them individually by helicopter cable, became a battle against the sea itself. One rescue helicopter crew described the tanker's stern rising and falling some 50 feet as they tried to time each hoist between swells. Twice, the hovering aircraft narrowly missed the deck entirely. Inside the crowded lifeboats, seasickness swept through nearly everyone as they waited their turn. Some passengers spending 8 hours or more exposed to spray, cold, and diesel fumes before reaching safety. Despite all of it, the fire, the isolation, the worsening storm, the age and fragility of many of those aboard, every single one of the 520 people on Prinsendam was pulled to safety. Not one life was lost. Coast Guard officials would later call it, for decades afterward, the greatest air-sea rescue in their service's history, surpassed in scale only by the far larger and very different evacuations during Hurricane Katrina a quarter century later. With her passengers and crew safe, Prinsendam herself was not immediately abandoned to the sea. Salvage teams managed to bring the fire under control, using the ship's own anchor chain to help stabilize operations, and the tug Commodore Straits took the gutted, smoldering hull under tow, bound for Portland, Oregon, where Holland America hoped she might eventually be repaired. She never made it. Weakened by fire damage and battered by the same deteriorating Gulf of Alaska weather that had complicated her rescue, Prinsendam took on water as she was towed south, and finally capsized and sank on October 11, 1980, coming to rest roughly a mile beneath the surface off Sitka, Alaska. For more than 4 decades, her exact resting place remained a matter of historical record rather than direct observation, until ANOAA Ocean Exploration Expedition using remotely operated vehicles set out in recent years specifically to locate and document the wreck. A rare case of a modern cruise ship becoming, quite literally, a site of underwater archaeology. The Prinsendam disaster is remembered less for what destroyed the ship than for what it revealed about human coordination under pressure. A radio officer who defied his own captain to save lives, a tanker captain who turned his fully loaded ship around without hesitation, and pilots from 3 different countries' armed forces flying, refueling mid-air, and hovering over mountainous seas hundreds of miles from any base, in conditions worsening by the hour as a dying typhoon pushed its last violent weather into their path. It stands as a powerful reminder that at sea, disaster rarely announces itself as a single, isolated event. Fire, distance, cold, and a strengthening storm all arrived together in the Gulf of Alaska that October night. And the fact that every one of the 520 people aboard walked, or was carried, away alive remains, more than 4 decades later, one of the most remarkable outcomes in the entire history of maritime rescue.